This lecture is called On Plotting and Planning. People think architects do a lot of planning, but of course we do a lot of plotting. We get to what we get to because we do a lot of plotting. You know, plotting and planning means the same thing in the case of a crime, that you're plotting something or you're planning something. It's generally not seen as very good. But as an architect, the reality is that you have to strategize over a very long period of time, consistently, to get to certain ends. Certain results don't just fall from the sky. They have to do with a principled application of your craft over a long period of time. And there's certain ideas that hover in your mind, and you try and try and try and try to make them happen. And some of them you cannot speak about. There is the unspeakable part, and this very much is a lecture about the generally unspeakable part. I can just say is that there are things that we would like to say here which we are not prepared to speak in public about things that we have plotted so extensively about and achieved at outcomes where we think if people knew what we were doing, they would not be amused. But we'll talk about what we can talk about in public. You want to?
Yeah, I mean, another dimension to the lecture is just to reveal some of the artifacts that is around storytelling and how do we look at how other people have plotted and planned or reflected on architecture and space. So it's not just in the sense of how we strategize to get some of the projects that we want, but it's also to think through in the past or in the future, how can we strategize to, make buildings that have a positive impact or make spaces that have a positive impact.
So it might be just worth saying is that Ilze and I, a husband and wife architect team, we work together. I think we work in very different ways, but I think that we share a similar ethic and we share a conviction about similar ends. But we're working with an office full of architects that assist us in achieving all of these ends. And what you're seeing here really is a collective effort of all of our work.
Also, thank you very much for this invitation. I mean, it's also nice for us just to reflect on some of the work in this very creative way that you've invited us to reflect on. So thank you.
I think we should start by talking about contract, because in the beginning, when we have a letter of appointment signed with a client, there are certain terms in that contract. And I would like to point you to something. Here you see page 4 and 5 of our standard letter of appointment, and I want to draw your attention to that line that is underlined in a big fat red line there, that says that as part of the sketch design, let me just see what it says,
the sketch design phase, we will produce a provocation which will be the
basis of discussions underpinning the design. Now, if you look at our industry contract, this is an amendment that we made to the industry contract. Instead of saying we will produce a sketch design, we say we will first produce a provocation. Now, I don't think there's a legal definition of what a provocation is, or anybody knows what's coming. But the idea with a provocation is that we are not going to start by having a sketch design. We're going to start by doing other stuff. And Ilze and I both engage in this other stuff as a beginning of a discussion, saying, well, could we first have discussions of a certain sort, or could we first move outside of the constraints set by this contract? Because a contract sets a brief, it sets a budget, it sets timelines, it sets everything. But we would leave a time for the production of a provocation. This idea that we can produce something unconstrained by the constraints of the project, and we could dream what it could be, with the idea that it is a kind of a play that we get into. So this idea that we involved in a kind of a play relationship with our client, or with the constraints, or with the site, and so on, that other things could be imagined, is very important. Because in the process, you imagine things that everybody might think is ridiculous, and in the end becomes the kernel of the design. So we always tell people, don't worry, we just play. None of this is going to matter. We can throw it all away. And of course, we don't. of course, we mean that something will come out of it. But of course, we also intend to throw some of it away, which is inherent in architectural design, but you don't necessarily talk about that. So I'm going to move along from this. So the next thing I want to talk about is cost. And this is a very, very pragmatic strategy. Is that if somebody gives us a building to design, we never price the building after we've produced the design. We always price the building before. We seldom work with people who have so much money that cost does not matter. So what happens is that there's a certain way in which people know when the cost of the building is right. But we find that they don't use that in the beginning of the process. So what we do, we blanked out the name of innocent parties. So what we do is we produce something where we ask the quantity surveyor to price the brief and various aspects of what is being decided at a certain standard. So this is a building that we're currently busy with. And you can see there, we started in October 2017 and a budget of 70 million was given. We refused to sign the contract because we said that that budget was unrealistic. It was not tied to the brief or any realistic expectation of the brief. We refused for months. Then COVID-19 came, and under duress we signed the contract. And the client said, we will never hold that against you.
Yeah, right.
We're not speaking about unspeakable things here. So then what we did is we took the brief as it was given, and we asked the quantity surveyor to use the cost norms of this, because this is for a type of client that repeatedly does this kind of building. So we said, don't price our design, price the norm. And they came to 84 million for the same thing if it's built in 12 months, and 85 if it's built in 18 months. And you can see the discrepancy. You can see why we refused to sign the contract, because we knew an unrealistic expectation was set. But if you look at this thing, you can see April 2020, May 2020, September 2020, the cost keeps on going up relative to our instruction. All of these are prices done by a quantity surveyor before we put pen to paper. So this is us interrogating what is necessary, what's the brief of the building, etc., etc. And you can see the cost have gone up 60%, 60, almost 80%, without the architects putting pen to paper. Now, if we put pen to paper first, all of that generally is blamed on the actions of the architect. You've pushed up the cost. That is a narrative that is like the plague that sticks to you. You cannot get it away from you. So we do not design anything before the quantity surveyor has not worked out how much it costs, independent of a design. So we're very happy to fit with the quantity surveyor's cost of a norm. But we've got to get the client to agree to that first, because then they argue with the quantity surveyor. They don't argue with us. And it's not a discussion about design. Because we find the moment there's a cost that the client doesn't like, they think it's a function of design, when usually it's a function of program, brief, or site, or something like that. So we get to agree that before we move ahead. And that is a very basic thing, because we want the design to be loose and happy and joyous and so on. And if you have the millstone of this kind of 60 to 80% budget increase around its neck, when it's not due to the design, you are fighting forever and you can never get the design approved. Okay, now I'm going to talk just about one project where plotting was a very big part of the scheme, and the plot was extensive and multidimensional. The plot starts with a project. Ilze and I got interviewed, and we didn't think the interview was particularly interesting or went anywhere. We had a sense that we won't get appointed because nothing extraordinary happened. They interviewed many of our clients, of our colleagues. Then what happens is one of our favorite ex-employees, a man called Adam, calls us in December, long after we've made the end of year appointments for the new year. We did that about a month ago, and Adam called, said, you said I can call you anytime for a job. And I said, yes, damn it, Adam, but you're calling on about the 20th of December. Do you know how late this is in the year? But I still like you. So we like you, we want to appoint you, but we would have to plot. This is going to be a big one. So we would have to get a new job to get you a job in order for you to work here. But we can do that. So we said, well, you know, we had these other people who interviewed us, but it didn't go particularly well, but let's go fishing and let's try and hook this fish. So what we then did is
This was a building that people came to us. It looked like this in the inside. Then what we agreed to do is that before we were appointed, while they were considering our appointment, we're going to write a book. And this is the book. It's called Situations for Creativity. It was for a business incubator, and you'll see it several pages. I'll show you the pages in the PowerPoint presentation. But this was a plot to get one of our favorite ex-employees re-employed in our firm. This is how it happened. So what we then said is that we're going to intrigue this client sufficiently that they will employ us. So we wrote a book about how you should have a business incubator. And I'm going to fly through these pages. And it starts off saying, this is a provocation and the beginning of a discussion. You see that. That was in our other contract for another job. But this was even before we were employed. We said, could we make a provocation? Could we tickle your fancy? Could we come up with some ideas,
some of which you can throw away and some of which we could use? Then we came up with this idea of great building sets up great situations. We illustrated the idea of a great situation. We spoke about what spaces are conducive to creative work. And then we started a series of drawings where we made a sort of Neufert's architectural data of what it would mean to work in a place where you want to stimulate creativity amongst co-workers. In Neufert's it looks like this, but in reality when you work it looks a bit more like that. But we're not interested in the individual. We're interested in what comes out of working together. We're interested in what happens if people talking to each other and when there's all sorts of socialization happening. And we think sitting at desks like this, facing each other, is not good. And perhaps sitting facing like this is better, like a classic library, or sitting overlooking other people, like this alto space, is even better. Or sitting outside and watching beautiful birds in the tree is really fantastic. Or we were saying, well, if you have a different kind of a workspace that works like this, maybe, you can work with people like that, or like that, And then we started illustrating different workspaces. Now you can sit when you have a view, how you can sit when you want to be isolated and you want to be alone. And then we were saying, but socialization for us is the key of being together and stimulating discussion amongst people. It's the basis of a creative workspace. And then we were saying, look, there's this kind of classic lecture type space. That is one kind of a thing. Then there's the classic discussion kind of a space. But then there's tea and coffee. And we were saying tea and coffee and meals maybe would be the core of a place where you want to stimulate creativity, because food destabilizes the program. So I could sit at a higher level looking down at the social space, and there's a woman that I would really like to meet, chat up and socialize with and actually go out on a date with. But she happens to be a computer scientist as well. And out of that impulse of mine that might be very socially driven, or personally driven, there's a social interaction that could emerge there. Or I could see that a director having lunch, and I know that he's very difficult to get to, but I could get a seat next to him because I can see the seat is open there in the dining space. And that's then indeed what we did. I'll show you, but the provocation ended with this diagram. Now this diagram is a very particular one because they said to us, look, you must build inside this building, but please, you cannot go into the ground, you cannot go out on the dry dock side, and you may not go through the roof. So there's a sketch design there. It's a cartoon, it's very funny, right? But it sets certain terms for breaking the rule, and that is what we were thinking about. So this was, in short, the project that was a shed. That we were given the yellow space, and they asked us, can we build inside of us? And when we looked at it, we thought, nah, that's not a very nice project. We wouldn't like to do that project. We would like to do another project. And also it's that we modeled the steel structure in Revit. And once we modeled the steel structure, we didn't put the partitions in, but it looked very much like the spaces in Star Wars, where they launched a spacecraft up. And once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. And you want to just launch something through this long space, and you don't want to have a partition. So then we said to him, why don't we take the shed and build a street right through the middle of the shed and then hover the business incubator above it, as opposed to building it somewhere else. Now this changes the site and it changes the brief. I can tell you, when we sat in the first design discussion, the the client was so angry, within the first 2 minutes, she was red in the face and she wanted to fire us. It was evident. I had to do the entire design presentation in the face of somebody who evidently wanted to fire us. I knew that the moment I stopped speaking, she's going to talk to a counterpart, which was the property owner, and convince him to fire us. We know this, and we've laughed about it many times because we built the building in the end. We had discussions before with her and with the client. He said, you asked us to think outside the box. And I said, yes, we want you to think outside the box. And then we said to him, do you have any inkling that if we really do that, that you would not recognize what you asked us to do? And they said, no, we want you to go all the way. So they wanted to fire us when we made the presentation, because we suggested that instead of them building their own space, that they collaborate with a whole lot of other actors in a public domain, make a richer urban world, and find common interest, because that makes for better urban environments and makes for more density of human interaction of different sorts, of a greater diversity of human interactions, and that would make for a better building. And to make a long story short, we then built this building inside this big shed. But you can see one of the things that you have there, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's a flying slab. You see here the underside. It was at a time of all these student revolutions. And we were asked to basically come up with a building that had a business incubator. The original client was a university. And we said to him, why don't you, instead of making an appearance, make something that has no appearance? Make it be known by what it does rather than what it looks like. So the business incubator sat on the upper level above these circular cutouts, and we said, let it be known by its ceiling. How many institutions are known by its ceilings? Almost none. But this space makes something possible. So we spoke about having a farmer's market underneath, having a fashion show, or having a car show there. But the idea was a basic market space, but with the idea that if you have Ferraris on show in the middle of the night, you see in the background, you have people who can sell memorabilia and have small little scale shops. And the same with a fashion show, is that you can have a fashion show going and you can have people selling shoes and jewelry and all sorts of stuff. And we stimulate a small economy in the unfolding of that. So the quantity surveyor priced this, and this ended up being $200,000 more expensive than the alternative. You would think it's nothing, but one day we got a phone call from the client saying we compared this to an alternative that they asked the quantity surveyor to do quietly, is to put this in concrete columns, and they decided that they don't have that money, they're not going to do it. Then I started having a robust discussion with a client over the phone. And that brings me to the last thing I want to speak about, is the power of the telephone. I really believe that you can bring down a small city over the telephone, or you can raise one. And this was one of those moments. So I realized in the heat of that moment, I probably have a minute to defend the fundamental part of this project. So we have sent these drawings to the client by that stage, and I said to him, you know what's wrong with you, Nick? The problem is that you have not thought about what the Batmobile will look like in this space, and you have not imagined this. And he says to me, sorry, excuse me? I said to him, you haven't thought about the Batmobile in the space. Imagine the shiny bonnet of the Batmobile and the lights flickering in it, and how many children you can get 8 o'clock at night, and what money you guys can make. Because in the end, they were saying they can't capitalize that rental and the income stream. And I said, you put this on concrete columns, it will look like one of your parking garages. You fly it in the sky over the Batmobile, and you'll make money any time of day with whatever you want to do. And then he said to me, can I have a rendering of that by tomorrow morning? So that was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So we put in the Batmobile, and we put in Batman into the thing, and we illustrated this principle of being able to get lots of people at different times of day into the building. And to make a long story short, we built it in the end. With this idea that you have a flexible space where things can be moved, you can have a whole lot of activities working at different times of the day over a fantastically beautiful hovering slab that sits above this business incubator that has its cafeteria right in the middle. This is an outdoor space.
that is the cafeteria. You arrive into the cafeteria. There's no front of desk receptionist. You arrive into the cafeteria. It is a social space with a coffee shop that you see there on the left-hand side. And then on the side, you have the various spaces where people are working and overlooking each other as per this book that we set up in the beginning. So everything that we promised in here as a provocation, we did, and it is a commercially successful building and the client is very happy. I'll move on to the next one.
So part of our strategy is also just to think through what are the kind of narratives that buildings have and how can they begin to show us particular wisdoms to what Heinrich has just spoken about, to strategize, to plot, and to also, very importantly, to intervene ethically into the structures that we are lucky to work within. And for a long time, we kind of, just were looking at various buildings that we like in the city. Some of the buildings are these big modern structures and, thinking through what are the stories behind these buildings. So I'm going to share just a few stories around particular buildings. The first one is related to this image on the screen. It is a commercial building from the 1970s, the late 1970s, in a neighborhood that experienced forced removals in Cape Town. And the building was designed by one of Cape Town's professors of architecture and urban design, and he was a student of Louis Kahn, and he's a very revered figure in the architectural landscape of our training and of the industry. But he made this drawing, a conceptual drawing of this building, which is called the Van Ruler Center. And while we were researching the story behind this building, which was at the time extremely under threat, the new owners of the building wanted to completely demolish this building. And while we were going through the archive, we came across this image, which is in the middle of the sketch. You find the kind of thumbnail sketch of the building, the form of the building, and to the left is the kind of addition that he had to formulate as part of a growing brief. As we know, briefs grow and desires grow. But on the right-hand side of the image is a drawing of a highway that is meant to be implemented in the future. But hovering above this highway is a question mark. And for us, the question mark is probably the most important part of this drawing. What does it mean? Because these drawings are so loaded with uncertainty already. None of the lines are straight, none of the images, none of the actual things are certain. But to really put a question mark above this highway and above this entire scheme became a very important way for us to visualize architecture actually in general and the archive of architecture through this kind of very uncertainty that it stands for, even though the architecture stands as these very certain kind of monuments in space. The second image is of a building that I've eventually written up as a book. It is a factory in Salt River, which is about 15 minutes walk from where we live in Observatory. And to cut a long story short, the factory essentially symbolizes and monumentalizes a very particular moment in South Africa and the kind of racialization and the feminization of labor in South Africa through architecture and through capital and through capital production. And the narrative and the biography of the story of this factory culminates in a book called Unstitching Rechtsvervoer. And again, while I was looking at the archive and while I was looking at the buildings, I found this incredible image at the Grote Schuur Hospital, which is up the road here. The Heart Museum, yes, exactly. Heinrich is reminding me.
While walking our oldest son in his press.
Yes. So this particular part of Cape Town is very famous for being the site for the world's first heart transplant. And up until the point when I went to the Heart Transplant Museum, I never found a beautiful image like this of the building. But what you see in this picture is a very prominent white cross in the foreground. And the white cross symbolizes or demarcates where the position where the woman
that eventually donated her heart for the world's first heart transplant, where she actually was killed by a oncoming car, a vehicle. So the image is very powerful, and meditating on this image made me think about, the archive very differently. And essentially, the story goes that when Christian Barnard heard about the potential donor for the world's first heart transplant, his first question to the doctor that informed him of this potential was, he asked the doctor, "Is she colored?" And for him to ask this question is extremely interesting, because at the time when all this experimentation around transplant and medical innovations was happening, there was a very strict kind of regime of racialization, and kind of people's histories were being completely segregated. So even within the kind of innovation of medical practice, the race and the gender of somebody was very important, because interracial heart transplants was definitely not allowed in 1967 when this image was taken in Cape Town. But it also points to a very particular history of this building, because that is the site in Cape Town where probably you would have found the most colored females, colored women, or racialized colored women in the city. So his question was completely, in a way, kind of informed by the site and his knowledge of that particular building. I eventually sort of used that story to think through what would it mean for a building that is extremely vacant and empty, and what would it mean for this site. But another story around this image is that when eventually Christian Barnard had the opportunity to move the new heart into the empty carcass, empty heart cavern, he said that he couldn't share that moment with anybody. He was completely masked, and he was sort of in this process of doing this very important work, but he wasn't able to share that moment. It was very private for him to see this kind of empty cavity of a human with no heart, and then this heart being moved in. And it made me think of this building as this kind of empty cavity, and what would it mean to actually bring in some kind of a new heart and a new pulse to this particular site. So the heart transplant and the story of Denise and Christian Barnard was kind of captured in this particular very strange image that I found by complete chance one day. An image of a pressed hibiscus, which is part of a growing archive in our office around the garden of a writer called Bessie Head. Bessie Head was a writer that worked in Botswana, but is actually from South Africa. And we sort of went on a complete tangent to think through, how does one look at a writer's legacy differently, and how does one look at a writer as a spatial practitioner. And the story goes that she was able to produce a house, a very humble house in Sirowe, where she's from the proceeds from a very first novel, When Rain Clouds Gather. And I was interested to think through what is the connection between literature and spatial production, and the proceeds, and the kind of, the kind of thinking through how would a writer then make a house. And this image, in a way, captures our way of, gathering an archive together around this work. And again, the story is captured in a publication where a whole series of pressed flowers from her garden in Botswana and from forced removal sites in Cape Town are captured and published and meditated on through letters and correspondence with others. I think it's time for a song, actually. I'm going to play some music. Just hope it's going to work. Does my speaker go off? Okay. The song in the background is a composition by Winston Mankunku Ngozi, a very important figure in South Africa, and composed this music called Yakalinkomo. And it's essentially a lament about the black person's position in society in 1968. It's also known to be one of the first expressions of black consciousness in South Africa. And we were interested around the archive of Winston Mankunku and in a particular building called the Docu-Dramas, where Yakalinkomo is known to maybe or maybe not have debuted there in 1968. So the song and the image on the screen is a way of also just capturing that history and telling another story about a very important building in Cape Town in South Africa. And again, the kind of trend of forced removals is also present in that particular moment. There's an image of the album, Yakalinkomo. Winston Mankunku was a saxophonist and he had a quartet, and he won the prize as the Golden Castle Musician of the Year. And I always find it ironic that he won this big prize. The Castle is a brand of beer in South Africa. He won this Golden Castle, but as a victim of forced removals, he's actually him and his family lost their own kind of home in Cape Town. So the ironies of apartheid is just astounding once you begin to think through these different kinds of points of intersection, music and literature and poetry and so on. And then for this image, I think I'd like to invite our professor over, Professor Lalu. Thank you.
Hello.
Move it closer.
So we'd like to invite Pramesh Lalu, who is a confidant, a friend, client, but also was one of the key instigators in a project that we are currently working on, which is the Greatmore building. It's in Greatmore Street. It's called 66 Greatmore in Woodstock, and Pramesh and a team of other people were kind of integral in trying to conceive of a building for a university, and especially a university with the kind of a legacy that I'm going to ask you just to expand on, and to think through how can we imagine an arts institution for this university. I started a kind of a very broad research project to try and think through what is the particular spatial practice of the University of the Western Cape, and then I came upon this image. Pramesh, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very nice to meet you. And thanks for the opportunity to say something together with Heinrich and Ilze, who have been guiding many of us through thinking about infrastructure, buildings, and history in very profound ways. So maybe I should just start by saying something about that picture. There's Paul Grendon, who unfortunately passed away last year, is the photographer whose work you see there. And Paul was a fellow in the Center for Humanities Research, which I directed at the time. He was an artist in residence. And the idea behind this image has been so profound in so many conversations over the many years we've interacted, but also in our own thinking about what it might mean to constitute an arts initiative at a historically black university that was disallowed any arts education under apartheid. So just to back up a little bit, under apartheid, legislation prohibited arts education or aesthetic education, expressive disciplines at any of the black universities except one in the Eastern Cape. And the idea behind that was to think about how to assault the senses. So apartheid was a project of an assault on the senses. And when we came across this image via Ilze and Heinrich, I think, we thought immediately about how this resembled precisely how we were approaching the question of an arts education in our institution. So it's been a long time in the making, but we had worked for many years with the Handspring Puppet Company. in a partnership in a rural area, and trying to think about the moving object, the kinetic object, and to think about, in some sense, how that kinetic object was both a metaphor for how we think the post-apartheid and post-apartheid freedom in particular, but also how we inhabit the spaces of apartheid's legacies. And in some sense, we had, through Handspring, begun to understand what it might mean to occupy the spaces of moving objects, and in their case, the puppets. So they're the world-famous makers of the warhorse, but in the early years, they'd worked very closely with William Kentridge, and we set up what was called the Laboratory of Kinetic Object, which was really the genesis of a larger ambition to constitute a new model of arts education that would emulate and epitomize what post-apartheid freedom might be. So I think that this image by Paul Grendon was what Ilze and Heinrich brought to us as a way to think about how we might imagine a facility that would house 3 projects. A laboratory of kinetic objects with Handspring Puppet Company and the next generation of puppeteers, a project in documentary film, and a third project in basically in jazz, but also some crossover strands of jazz and Cape Town musical histories. Okay. So I don't know if that helps to kind of frame some of my excitement at seeing that image again.
And maybe I can just add that for us as a practice, this image has become really influential in how we can think about architecture differently, because we are trained to think of architecture as this kind of abstract space that you inhabit afterwards, that you sort of design these discrete rooms, these modernist kind of conceptions of very discrete and clear boundaries. Whereas when you look at this image, you kind of see Katrina Majid, who's the builder and architect in the image there, building with intention a structure around some of her belongings and some of the resources that she's gathered, and even a family member already inside the structure. So it is a kind of a complete kind of unlearning of how we've been trained, and a kind of a homage to a practice that we actually know as a society so deeply already. This image is taken in 1991. So this is contemporary architecture. This is not a kind of historical homage to something in the past. This is contemporary architecture, and this is a kind of a contemporary moment of reflection. And working with Primesh and the rest of the CHR team, we found this kind of beautiful match around how architecture and a kind of a very strong intent of how an art education is imagined, how that is coupled in a powerful way. And this image just helped us to conclude and to kind of hold that conversation. So I'm very grateful to Paul Grendon and to Katrina and to Charmaine, who's in the picture. I managed to find out everybody's names in that. And what you see in the kind of dwelling is the contribution of Handspring, the contribution of the jazz musicians, and the future inhabitation of this building.
I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about maybe working together, and if there's anything that you think is sort of specific about the relationship, or because this is a kind of academic client, as opposed to, I don't know, your experiences with developers or private individuals. It's sort of like how your relationship maybe is affected by that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a remarkable one is that we have different kinds of relationships with different clients. We work with lots of artists, and I think we work with developers and government and so on, but I think maybe working with academic and artists are the same, in that what's really wonderful about working with academics and artists, you can talk about ideas, and it's generative ideas. In other words, you know that thing of being able to think about something and accept the consequences of your conclusions is a thing that I think both academics, or good academics, and artists are practiced in, that without a form or an institution or whatever consequence of that idea, you establish the idea that you think should reign that should be the dominant idea. And then from there, you pursue to find the architectural corollary of that idea. But we found with Pramesh particularly, I think he's an amazing institution builder. But this thing of saying, well, what is it that we're thinking? We're talking lots, and I think we're having ongoing discussions about future projects also. But we try and set the mark for what is it that we want, and then what would that mean, and then what architecture or design would follow from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're talking about an academic client, I think we're missing the point actually that, I mean, Pramesh is a kind of a rogue academic. It's like a rogue.
I am.
You are rogue. You know, like, you're completely like.
I like that.
You know what I mean? Sort of like coming out of nowhere in a way and becoming this kind of force for institutional planning. Actually, you know, I mean, this project wasn't imagined within the University of the Western Cape's future plan. It wasn't part of the institutional plan's 5-year kind of rollout of infrastructure, you know, of buildings, and it kind of all sort of, you know, organically came to this point where we say this is UWC is going to have an arts building,
Right.
an arts building that is not like any other arts building. It's going to be conceived of differently, and I think that in this case, Pramesh is more of a co-creator in a sense, you know. That's why this image is so important, because we may be able to, you know, build the structure and the kind of intent around it, but the kind of heavy stuff is already inside, and that is what Pramesh has really come with as a kind of a spatial thinker in that sense.
No, I think both of those are important summations of our ongoing partnership and relationship. I think for me as director, the big ambition was to connect humanistic inquiry with the arts. And for 10 years, I was struggling to figure out how does one put those two things together, because they don't, you know, they're meant to be together, but they don't necessarily live together. And I found that the one way to do that is through circuiting that discussion through an architectural debate about the way in which one hosts a conversation between the arts and the humanities.
Yeah.
And so that's what I think we've achieved here. They don't know that I've been drawing on all their resources to try and put together a bigger, you know, intellectual ambition in the university. But I do think that what's guiding it is a desire to ask whether the humanities and the arts can redefine a concept of freedom for us now.
That's such a beautiful way to end, and also a wonderful example of kind of plotting and counter-plotting and how this interrelationship. I think it's just wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Liv.